They said it was straight line wind. Said it wasn't a tornado. No, not a tornado, just straight line wind. You could have fooled me. I was hiding in the hall. It's the onlyest room in my house where there's no glass. I had all my storm accoutrement. I had my weather radio. I had water. I had snacks. You never know how long the storm will last. I had the pillows off my bed in case I need to put them over my head or protect parts of my body if something fell. I tried to get my interns to come and hide in the hall with me, but they are native Texans. So they are made of much sterner stuff than I am. They were in their room, sitting cross-legged on the bed, playing gin together. And if Gene was here to tell his version of this story, he would say, my wife Peggy said gin, and the whole house shook. I heard a sound that sounded like 100 witches' fingernails digging down a blackboard. It wasn't exactly a crash so much as it was a sound you could feel deep inside your body. We went running to the back door and threw it open. Nothing but green. Couldn't get out that way. Ran to the front door. Ran around the house. Wasn't my tree. It was the neighbor's tree that had fallen. And that sound, like 100 witches' fingernails, was the heavy, heavy branches of that tree digging its way down the siding on the side of my house, about 2.5 feet from where Gene and Peggy had been playing gin. And I didn't even want to think about what it would have been like if it had fallen in even a slightly different direction. I did something I'd never done before. I called the insurance company to make a claim. I see that some of you have done that. I called the insurance company to make a claim, and a couple of days later, a man called my home, and he asked me if there was a hole in my house. I said, no, not a hole, not really. And he said, well, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is go to the people first who do have holes in their houses, and if you don't mind, I'll put you on the end of the list. I said, I didn't mind, that was fine. And we agreed on a day and a time when he was going to come and see about my damages. And being a Southerner, on the right day, I made some cookies and I put on a pot of coffee, because if you're a Southerner, there is no such thing as a repairman, and there is no such thing as an adjuster. There are only friends you have not met yet. He came inside carrying a clipboard, and the first thing he said to me was, do you know any poems? I said, do you mean like, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon? Or did you have something more serious in mind, like Paul Laurence Dunbar? He said, if you can say a poem for me right now, from start to finish, that isn't, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, I'll give you a 5% deduction on your deductible. I said, what can I get if I can say 20 poems? He said, I can see I have asked the wrong person. He said, okay. I said, you mean now? He said, sure, go ahead. All right, I said. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, has elsewhere had its setting and cometh from afar. Not an utter nakedness, and not an entire forgetfulness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Whoa, he said, I like that. Who's that? I said, Wordsworth. And he clicked his ballpoint pen and wrote Wordsworth, 5% deduction. Cool. And we went out back to look at the damage. Now, we started at the corner of the house, and I was really, really impressed because he had one of those tape measures, the kind you can pull out for an enormous length, and when you get through, all you have to do is push a button and it goes. I've always wanted one of those. I think they only sell them to men. And he measured out a whole piece of fencing, and he said, I estimate it's going to cost $125 to $150 to repair this section of fence. I said, I'm not going to repair this part of the fence. Well, I'm going to bring my grandson out here with a rubber mallet, and I'll hold one end of it, he'll hold the other, and we'll beat the kinks out of it, but it's the back of the house, not the front of the house. I don't really need to replace it. I just want the money to replace the shed and the deck. He took that tape measure and went over the side of my house with all that deep scratching down the side of it. And he measured. He said, I think it's going to cost about $350 to repair this part of the house. I said, I'm not going to repair that part of the house. What? Who do you think I'm going to impress? The man that reads the water meter? The only people who see this part of the house are people who go down the alley. I just want the money to replace the shed and the deck. He said, lady, shut up. You have $500 deductible. Get it? I said, that's the worst scratch I've ever seen in my life. I don't know if I could hold my head up if I had to live in a house that looked like that. He said, oh, come on now. And after a while, after he'd measured what had once been my deck and what had been the shed, we went back in the house. He said, can you be at home for the next 40 minutes? I said, sure, if you need me to be. He said, it isn't a need to, it's a would like to. I can, if you like to, I can be home for the next 40 minutes. He said, if you could just stay here for 40 minutes, I'm going to take all these figures and go out and sit in the front seat of my truck and enter all of it in the computer. And in 40 minutes, I can figure out what we can offer you, and I could come right back in here, and if you accept my offer, I could write a check, and you could accept it, and you wouldn't even have to see me again. I said, that'd be swell. And so I gave him some cookies, and I poured him another cup of coffee. He'd take out, you can eat a batch of cookies in 40 minutes if you work at it. And figuring makes a lot of people hungry. Well, after he went outside, I got some cookies, and I got some coffee, and just as he had gone out the door, he said, while I'm out there, would you like some poems to read? Well, I wasn't really sure what that meant. Did he like to write poems and he wanted people to read them? I'm willing. Was the poetry a way to show deep religious faith? You may find this hard to believe, but there are a lot of people in Dallas that are worried about my soul. It's true. But I figured no matter what the purpose was, I was game. If I didn't like them, I didn't have to finish reading them. So he opened up his clipboard. It actually had a sort of a little drawer underneath it. Pretty cool. And he pulled out a whole stack of papers and handed them to me just before he went out the door. Well, I took my coffee and my cookies and I sat down at the dining room table to look at these poems. And that's what they were. Poems. Not verse, not doggerel. Poetry. Poetry from some of the finest minds of our time. Carl Sandburg, Robert Frost, and William Carlos Williams, and Theodore Roethke, and E.E. Cummings, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, some of the finest minds of our time. Poetry. Every single page printed, I was certain, off the internet from a computer. And I sat down and I began to read. Some of them were already known to me. I remembered some of them from school, like old friends I hadn't seen in years. Something there is that does not like a wall, that wants it down. Oh, a man could do worse than be a swinger of birches. Luck is a star. Money's a plaything, and the sky still goes blue and gold at night, and blue and gold at morning, and the fireborn, they go far, being at home in the fire. I began to read the poems out loud, for the sound of the words in my mouth and the sound of the words in my ears. Lincoln at the Chancellorsville Review, with troops to the right and to the left of him, turned to the general and said, "What will all these poor boys do when this great war is over?" I read and read and read, and 40 minutes passed by, to me like the speed of light. You can tell that because I forgot to eat those cookies. And before I knew it, he's back on my porch, knocking on my door again. And he came in and he made a settlement with me, and he offered me enough to replace the deck and the shed and absorb the $500 deductible. So it wasn't going to cost me anything to replace the shed and the deck. And then he said, "Well, what'd you think of the poems?" I said, "They were just wonderful, just wonderful." He said, "I love them too. Which one was your favorite?" I said, "Well, I don't even know how to tell you which one was my favorite. There's one I didn't understand." He said, "Really? Which one was that?" I said, "That one, the Emperor of Ice Cream. I didn't get it." He said, "Oh, that's my favorite." I said, "Then read it to me. If you read it to me and it's your favorite, I know I'll get it then. Just read it to me." And he picked up the page and he began to read. "Call the roller of big cigars, the muscular one, and bid him," and I saw a tear rolling out of his eye and down through the creases in that brown, weathered outdoor face. He kept on trying to read, and soon his face was running wet with tears. He said, "It's not me. It's not me. I'm not crying. It's not me. It's not me. I had a stroke. It's the stroke that makes me do that. I don't cry." I said, "I like to believe that if you had read me that poem before you had the stroke, it would still have moved you to tears." He said, "Well, it's not all right for me to cry." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, I'm a man and men don't cry." I said, "Do you believe in God?" Well, yes, how could you ask me a thing like that? Do you believe in a God that gave you tear ducts? Well, yes. Do you think God makes mistakes? I've never met anybody like you before, he said. I said, if you want to cry, come on, sit down, I'll cry with you. I'm good at crying. Read the rest of the poem to me. And he did. And when he finished, he raised his face to mine and he said, I had a stroke. I had a bad stroke. I lost a lot of my language. I felt so helpless and so vulnerable. I was so scared. My wife, she's used to being real well taken care of. I'd always taken pride in taking good care of my wife. It scared her so bad to see me like that. She left me. We're divorced. I'm not mad at her. I understand. She just couldn't take seeing me like that. It hurt too much. I understand. Somebody told me that if I started reading poetry, maybe I would regain some of my language skills. I sure do spend a lot of time reading poetry. I said, and did it help you? Did it help me with what? Did it help you regain your language skills? I don't know, he said. I don't even think about that anymore. I don't think about it at all. I've just fallen in love with the words. I've fallen in love with the words. These are my favorite poets, he said. Who are your favorite poets? I said, oh, that's easy. My favorite poets are Emily Dickinson and Edna St. Vincent Millay and Mary Oliver and Naomi Shihab Nye and Liesl Mueller and, if I get more than 5, Lucille Clifton. And he said, those are all women. Women write poetry. I said, yes. He said, a wise man would read that, wouldn't he? Probably, I said. Probably. Well, do you mind, he said, if you write down those names, because they're not names I know. And so I took a pencil and I wrote on a page from the clipboard all those names. And because I used to be a librarian, I threw in a few more too. And then I drew a line down the center of the page. I said, you write your favorites for me. And then we'll tear the paper in half. And you read the ones that are my favorites, and I'll read the ones that are your favorites. And then both of us will know more poems, because both of us will have fallen in love with the words. We just have fallen in love with the words. So Bobby started it. It's his fault. I'll end with a poem. I'll tell you that every year when school starts, to me that's the beginning of the year in September. And I go out and buy a notebook, a small one, spiral bound. And I write down the titles of all the stories that I know in that book. I begin on the second page, and I write all the stories that I know in it, not the stories, just the titles. So that when evenings like this come, I can look at the names of all those stories and figure out what I'd like to tell you, because I'm always afraid I'll forget about a story that I know. Ooh, that would be just the one I want to tell. What if you forgot it? Forgot about the fact that it even exists? But in the front of the book, before you get to the names of all his stories, I always write a poem. And every year it's a different one. Every year it's a poem I want to live by. So this is the poem that went into the book when I bought it back in. I'm the president of our State Storytelling Association this year, so the September book got bought a couple of weeks ago. And I start at the back of the book, by the way, and record everything I tell and where I tell it. Just in case you invite me back again, you won't have to hear the same stories because I'll know what I told when I was here. I'll have written it in my book. And by the time the year is over, what I know comes to meet what I've told, sort of in the middle of the book. This is by Edna St. Vincent Millay. The courage that my mother had went with her, and is with her still. Rock from New England quarried, now granite in a granite hill. The golden brooch my mother wore, she left behind for me to wear. I have no thing I treasure more, yet it is something I could spare. Oh, if she had left to me the thing she took into her grave, her courage, like a rock that she has no more need of, and I have. Thank you.